going to try this again. It looks like it did not work. I'm going to have to figure out on the internet here. But anyway, this is a re-recording of our lesson we did on the 20th. And the lesson, we had internet problems on that day and it did not record. So I'm coming back. Today's the 29th. We just got back from Maryland to go to our granddaughter's wedding, and then I wanted to get this recorded so we have it in our Facebook and on our in our page there, so that we can our YouTube channel, so that we can look at them in the future if you want. So anyway, let me get the PowerPoint up, and we'll start with this once again. Hang on a second while I get all of the settings in place. So we talked about chapter 7 before, and this was talking about this dream that Daniel had about the 4 beasts, and we talked about what that meant. We're looking at chapter 7 this time from a different perspective. And it's a look at this chapter that's different than I've ever looked at it before, but talking about how it shows that we get distracted. So we had in chapter 2 a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had about a large statue, different metals that it was made of, and each of those layers of metals represented a kingdom, a man's kingdom. Starting with the kingdom of Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar was king of, down through Rome. This time in Daniel 7, we talked about last week, is this dream that Daniel had, and it was a dream of 4 beasts. These beasts also represent those same kingdoms that we looked about in chapter 2. So you kind of wonder, well, what is the difference there? Well, they represent the same kingdoms, but it's from a different perspective. In one perspective, the Nebuchadnezzar dream, it's kind of from man's perspective, the glorious kingdoms of man, and made out of precious metals and so forth. But Daniel's dream is looking at those kingdoms more from God's perspective, and that they are just horrible beasts that consume and devour and destroy. And so it is a different perspective on those same kingdoms. But chapter 7, it kind of we concluded that it really gives us a lot of hope and encouragement. It's like when we set our GPS on the destination that we want to go, and we know that it's going to get us there because we know the end point. And chapter 7 kind of lays out God's strategy over time, how he works with the history of mankind. And we know that it ends God's way, in a good way, and there's ultimate victory. So we see in this chapter lots of hope of salvation, of eternal life. All the wrongs they're all going to be righted. The sins are going to be judged. There's joy and forgiveness and restoration, renewal, all of these things, and God's ultimate victory and wiping away of all the tears. So chapter 7 is outline of all that and gives us hope because we see that. So let me start with the video, and we'll talk about that from a different perspective.
It is so easy to get distracted. I mean, distractions, they don't just gravitate towards us. It's like we crave them. I mean, it is so easy to get distracted, and not just a little distracted, like for long periods of time. It's like you flip on your phone and open one app, and next thing you know, hours fly by. Or you turn on Netflix and just start just one episode, and next thing you know, hours fly by. We crave distraction. And it's so easy with everything that is around us to become distracted. We crave distraction if we're standing in a grocery line. We'll grab our phone just to help it go by in a way in which doesn't seem, laborious, doesn't seem overwhelming. Or if we're, sitting in a plane, we crave distractions. Or if we're driving, we shouldn't, but we crave distractions. Or let's even be honest, sometimes even when we're sitting in the pews, we crave distraction. And I think there's a lot of reasons in every setting of why distractions not only come easily to us, but why we crave it. Chief among them, though, is this. In this world that we live in, sometimes what we see and what we engage and what we encounter is so overwhelming that we want just something to help us go numb, just something to help us go blind, because what we see in the world around us and what we see in the mirror can be so daunting that all we want to do is to be distracted. Listen, it is easy to get distracted because we crave it. And we are now about ready to dive into Daniel chapters 7 through 12. And here's what I want to say at the very beginning. Oh my goodness, will it be tempting to get distracted? Because Daniel chapter 7 through 12 is filled with all kinds of images that are unfamiliar, not just to us, but to the book of Daniel. I mean, the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel has been going pretty good. I mean, we had some weird visions with Nebuchadnezzar and some strange dreams, but come on, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, Daniel in the lion's den. Like, we not only know these stories, but these stories connect with us. They ignite in us. But Daniel's chapter 7 through 12, the images get strange. Because we're going to start seeing beasts coming out of the sea. We're going to start seeing rams attacked by goats and little horns talking. And in the midst of all of this unfamiliar imagery, it will be so easy to get distracted, and we might even start to crave it. But here's what I want to tell you right here at the very beginning. Even though the imagery is changing, the message is not. The theme of the book of Daniel is not. For Daniel chapter 7 through 12, it has the same central theme as Daniel chapters 1 through 6. Identity. Who we are in light of who God is. So please, don't get distracted because things are about to get wild. Daniel chapter 7 verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream. Now, Daniel's having a dream, not Nebuchadnezzar, not a king. Daniel is having a dream, and Daniel gets overwhelmed by what he sees. Daniel sees this great sea that is churning, and a sea is a Jewish symbol for evil or chaos. So immediately he's put on edge. And all of a sudden, from this sea emerges 4 beasts. 4 beasts that all have a little bit of a different beast will be standing for the kingdom of Babylon. The second beast looks like a bear, and the bear's kind of lopsided and it has ribs in its mouth. And this beast this bear will symbolize the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire. Then we have the third beast. The third beast will look like a leopard. It will be emphasizing its quickness, the rapidity of this beast. And this beast stands for the Greek Empire. And then we see the fourth beast. This beast is not compared to anything in creation. This beast is so terrifying, is so frightening, there is no comparison. This beast stands for the Empire of Rome. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. We've actually seen all 4 of these kingdoms appear before. but it was in chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. And it was in a very different context because these four kingdoms were not represented as beasts in Daniel 2. They were represented as precious metals. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream that not only will he not share the dream to his wise men, but he wants them to interpret it without him telling them anything about it. And he becomes enraged whenever they decide to sidestep it. And eventually Daniel steps in and says, I believe my God will reveal to me not just the dream, but the interpretation. He prays along with his friends. And God reveals this statue made of precious metals. And the head of gold stood for Babylon. And the silver, the chest and the arms of silver was the Medo-Persian Empire. And then you had the belly and the thighs of bronze, that was the Greek Empire. And then you had the legs and the feet mixed with iron and clay, that was the Roman Empire. So the natural question is, why is it that Daniel talks about the same four kingdoms, but in Daniel 2, they're precious metals? But in Daniel 7, they're now four beasts. You see, Daniel chapter 2 was revealing how these four empires, these four kingdoms, are viewed by humanity. For when we look at them, we see precious metals. But Daniel chapter 7 shows us God's perspective, how God views these same four kingdoms. And when he looks at them, what he sees is malicious beasts trying to counter his kingdom's purpose, trying to conquer his people. And in the midst of this imagery, with these four beasts, Daniel gets distracted by a little horn on the fourth beast. Read verse 8. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little horn, which came up among them, and three of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Now hear me very clearly, don't get distracted. I'm telling you, this imagery is weird. And even as we have the four beasts unfold and they're terrifying, now Daniel is distracted by a little horn. But I promise whenever I say, this is about the identity of God and how that shapes our identity. And what I love so much about our God is that even when we become distracted, he works hard to redirect our attention. Look what God does in verse 9. Daniel gets distracted by this little horn, and in verse 9, all of a sudden Daniel says, as I looked, thrones were set in place. And the Ancient of Days took his seat, and his clothing was as white as snow, and the hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. And a river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him, and thousands upon thousands attended him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and the court was seated, and the books were opened. What an image. What an amazing moment where Daniel is brought into the very presence of God, where Daniel is taken to the throne room of God and seen a worship service that many of us would kill to see. And how does Daniel respond? By getting distracted. In verse 11 and following, all of a sudden, listen how verse 11 starts. Then I continued to watch because the boastful words the horn was speaking. Wait, what? Like you're brought into the throne room of God and you're still talking about the horn? You're still focused on the little horn that's boasting and saying all kinds of arrogant things? Daniel, why are you getting distracted? Let's cut him a little slack. Because let's be honest, it's easy to get distracted. We crave it. And I would love to say that the presence of God cures that. But the reality is we can be in the very presence of God and still not see him. Be so overwhelmed with the moment that we long to merely find something else that can make us feel comfortable, that seems familiar, that distracts us and numbs us just for a little bit. And yet I love the fact that we have a God that whenever we become distracted, he works hard to redirect our attention. Verses 13 and 14. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. Whenever we hear the phrase son of man, we Christians typically think Jesus, and I don't think that's inappropriate. Because even though we're in the book of Daniel, what you're about to see is an image in advance of Jesus' ascension, him coming on the clouds from earth to heaven. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence, and he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. A cure for the distraction was this incredible revelation of who God is. He is the victorious one. He is the sovereign one. He is the one that establishes a kingdom that will not pass away. And how does Daniel respond? Distracted. Verse 15. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. They disturbed you? You just saw Jesus before Jesus lived on the earth. You were just in the presence of a worship ceremony for the Ancient of Days, and you're disturbed? You see, one of the things that Daniel is looking at and seeing is that right now he's living under this first beast, this head of gold, this lion-like beast. But what he sees in that initial vision is that might be where he is now, but it's only going to get worse. And he's overwhelmed. Even in the presence of God, his current situation of the stuff he's going through overwhelms him to the point where he does not see God clearly. Listen, it is easy to get distracted. It is easy to get distracted because we crave distraction. But we serve a God that works incredibly hard to redirect our vision. Verse 18, this messenger is sent to Daniel, and in verse 18 he says, but look at the holy people of the Most High. They will receive the kingdom, and they will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. And Daniel responds with more distraction. Verse 21, as I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them. Daniel says, I'm focused on the horn because I'm watching the horn destroy God's people. And the angel says, I understand that can be distracting. But verse 27, let me focus you on what the main point is. Verse 27, then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. In the midst of our distractions, God works hard to redirect our attention to the truth of who he is, which ultimately reveals who we are. But we will always have the opportunity to respond to his revelation through his visions, to his scripture, with more distraction. For Daniel ends this chapter in verse 28 saying, I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale. Listen, it's easy to get distracted, even for prophets of God. We crave distractions. But here's what I want to tell you as a way of not just explaining chapter 7, but of setting up chapters 8 through 12. Absolutely, it is easy to get distracted because it is really hard to see God clearly when we do not even pay attention to him. Even when we are in his presence, it is so easy to overlook who God is because of what we are going through. because of what seems to be crashing around us in this world, because of what we see when we look in the mirror and we are not satisfied. But listen to me very clearly, distractions are cancer. Distractions will never deliver what your heart is craving. Distractions merely take you away from the truth of who God is and who you are. And as we progress through Daniel chapters 7 through 12, I want you to grab onto this truth. However crazy the imagery gets, grab onto this truth that what the book of Daniel is about identity. And the clearer you see who God is, the clearer you will see who you are and how to act. But the enemy would love nothing more than for you to stare into the incredible, unbelievable visions of Daniel and walk away deeply disturbed because you were simply distracted. So here's my plea. Fight the distraction and cling instead to the identity of the Ancient of Days.
So interesting thought. I'd never really looked at chapter 7 in that way. I've always focused on the beasts and what they represent. And so I guess I have to be like Daniel, distracted there. So it is important, I think. And I think Shane points out, I think, a truth here for us all is just stay focused on Lord. So when is something a distraction? How can we tell between a distraction and a priority? And I think we agreed in class that day that a distraction is something that actually takes us away from the priority. And what's the priority for us is to know God and to follow His ways and understand who we are around Him or through Him. So that's what we can learn from there. And part of that has to do with focus, doesn't it? How we focus to stay on those things that are priorities and what's important and not get distracted. So these I went through in the internet and looked for things on focus and picked out these sayings, which I'm sure many of you have heard before, but I think they're all along the same truths that Shane was getting to in his lesson here. So focus on God, not your problem. Listen to God, not your insecurities. Rely on God, not your own strength. When you fix your thoughts on God, God fixes your thoughts. Don't focus on yourself because we change all the time. Focus on God who never changes. Instead of focusing on how big our problems are, focus on how big God is. Waiting is a sustained effort to stay focused on God through prayer and belief. Isn't that true? Focus on Jesus, not the storm. Remember what Peter was going through when he was walking on the water towards Jesus. And then when he started looking at the storm, he sank. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. So focus is key to that. I found another little video by Charles Stanley that talks about focus that I thought that was appropriate for this lesson.
The more you focus on your difficulty, your hardship, or even your pain when you're suffering, the more you focus on it, what happens? The bigger it gets. Well, I've been going through this, and I've been going through that. And if your friends listen to you and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I feel so sorry for you," the more pity they give you, the bigger it gets, and the bigger it gets, the more you doubt God. And so the issue is focus. And when I think of focus, I think of many instances in the Bible, but one of the primary ones is Daniel in the lion's den. And so the Bible says he slept with the lions all night. If he'd have been focused on lions, he wouldn't have been sleeping. He'd have been over in the corner somewhere, all crouching down, hoping that they wouldn't see him or something. And it brings me back to one of my most favorite illustrations when God just did something for me in one of the most difficult times of my life. It probably was up to the very top. And this lady came to see me, and she said, I want you to have lunch with me, and then I want to take you up to my apartment and show you something. Well, she was about 70 something, and I was 30 something, so I felt pretty safe. And we ate lunch, and I went to see her, and I was going through a very difficult time at church. They were doing their best trying to get rid of me. And so we walked in. She said, "Now don't sit down. I want to show you something." Walked over and showed me this picture of Daniel in the lion's den. And she said, "Now, son, I want you to tell me what you see." So I said, "Well," and I can still remember looking at that picture. I see this lion over here looking up and this one looking down and see the bones. And so I thought of everything this little lady could possibly have thought about. And she said, "Well, do you see anything else?" I said, "No." She said, "If you'll notice." And the picture had all these lines, and Daniel had his hands behind him. He was looking at this ray of light. She said, "What I want you to see is Daniel doesn't have his eyes on the lions, but on God." It was like God hugged me that day. Because from that moment on, all of my fears disappeared, and all of my uncertainties, and a lot of other things probably disappeared, because she got my focus right. When you focus on the trouble and the heartache and the burden and the pain, it gets bigger, and we feel less confident, less significant, and overwhelmed. Because remember this, Daniel was looking at omnipotence, who created the lions. He could shut the lion's mouth. He could have killed every one of them in a second. He just let them hang around while Daniel went to sleep that night. And before he probably went to sleep, and when he woke up, he went over and looked up, and just reminding of God that he was where he was because he had obeyed God, and God delivered him. God always operates on the basis of principles, not on the basis of feelings and how we feel, and so on principles. For example, the simplest one is we reap what we sow more than we sow, later than we sow. God always operates. He doesn't ever change that. And so, for example, one of those principles is obey God, leave all the consequences to him. That means I'm going to do what he says. I'm going to let him take care of the consequences. God always acts. For example, he says one of those principles is that God acts in behalf of those who wait for him. And so if I'm going to act on the basis of principle, then I know I'm going to be heading in the right direction, doing the right thing, because God operates on principles. And that's the reason you and I can learn how to relate to him, because if I don't understand his ways, then I'm going to say, "God, what are you up to?" Well, he's just up to doing and being who he says he is. And so you could come up with most any problem, and I believe, give me a little time, and I could come up with a principle to say, if you'll obey this principle, watch what happens. Because God wants us to obey him. And listen, leave the consequences to him. Let me ask you a question. Is there any consequence of your obedience God can't handle? Right? None. He can handle every one of them. Well, if I obey him and leave the consequences to him, here's what happens. I'm going to be able to have peace and a sense of joy and confidence and assurance. It doesn't make any difference what's going on, because he's in control. And if I'm obeying him, he's already taken care of it. Because, listen, the only thing that can happen in your life is what God allows. If you're a child of God, what he allows for a reason. I may not like it, and there have been lots of times I've told him I didn't like it. And you know what he said? Nothing. Nothing. He just let me hammer away with it and deal with it until I finally said, "God, I know you're right. I don't like this. I know you're right, because that's what your word says. And even though I don't like it, I want you to have your way no matter what." The more you...
So I think then with that idea of chapter 7, what Shane Wood says, what Dr. Stanley says here. So the focus really of us is this verse here. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints most high. His kingdom and is an everlasting kingdom. All dominion shall serve and obey him. And if we look at chapter 7 in terms of focus and distraction, and if we focus on this verse, I think that is a great lesson from chapter 7. So I was thinking, I saw this, I was looking at distraction things on the internet and I saw this T-shirt, easily distracted by shiny objects, and I can raise my hand and say, yep. And so I was thinking maybe I need to order that T-shirt. Anyway, so that's chapter 7, and the next time we're in Daniel, we'll be looking at chapter 8, and with the vision of the ram and the goat. And with that, that's chapter 7, and we will go with that, and we will onward and upward.